Okay, I think we are live now, so we can begin.
Great.
All right, good evening and welcome to another session of Ideas Conclave. The topic of today's session is decolonization and democratization, Fatima Jinnah in post-colonial Pakistani politics. Just to introduce myself, I am Aalene Mahum Aneeq, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I teach history at LUMS and ITU, and I did my master's in South Asian Studies from the University of Oxford a couple of years ago. Joining me is Dr. Reza Pirbhai, who teaches at Georgetown University, and he's an expert in South Asian and post-colonial studies. He is the author of the books Reconsidering Islam in a South Asian Context and Fatima Jinnah, Mother of the Nation, the latest book. And today we will be discussing his latest book on Fatima Jinnah, and hopefully our discussion will shed broader light on Fatima Jinnah's life, as well as the insights it gives us about post-colonial Pakistani politics. So thank you, Dr. Pirbhai, for joining us for this very interesting sort of topic and discussion. It is a pleasure to have you on board.
The pleasure is mine. It's very good to chat about these topics with students in Pakistan.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to sort of, start off by just asking you generally about your book and, just general motivations about why you wanted to write on Fatima Jinnah, what really sort of prompted you to do that, and also around the archive to, what was the archive like in terms of the challenges that you faced, or to what extent it facilitated you in this research, and also the methodological challenges of writing an academic biography of a figure who carries such an ethereal persona and national significance. It's really not an easy task to write about such an important figure. So what sort of thoughts do you have about that?
Well, a very good question. I actually teach modern South Asian history, as do you. And obviously, gender plays a very important role. No history is worth its salt unless you're also speaking about the women of any place or time. And I found that as I was, putting together the reading lists and so on for my courses, plenty of scholarship on gender and on individual women and so on, but very little mention of Fatima Jinnah at all, which struck me as something of a surprise, given the place that she has in the Pakistani imagination, while she has very little place in that of the scholarly world that produces so much work on gender in South Asia. So I thought, that would be something to look into, and an individual that I really wanted to know more about myself. But on the other hand, I also am not a big believer in, thinking in terms of great men and women in history, the individual as opposed to the class or the heritage, the group that a person belongs to. So when I looked at Pakistani production, any kind of literature on Fatima Jinnah, of course, it's entirely hagiographic. She's a saintly figure, a heroine, not someone that was really human, and history is about human beings. So what I really wanted to do once I started to look into the subject more and figure out where I'm going to get some information, the sources that I'm going to use, what I really wanted to do was place Fatima Jinnah not on the pedestal which Pakistani ideology places her, but rather in the class and time, the place that she lived and worked. And that, of course, begins with colonial Bombay, Calcutta, and then Karachi, obviously, in the post-colonial context. And so it's biography as social history that I was most interested in. And using Fatima Jinnah, a figure of some note, and at least in Pakistan, a name that's well known, to speak more generally about women of her class and background and time. Use her as a representative figure in that sense, rather than an iconic figure. So that's basically where the research began, the kinds of ideas that drove it. And then to your second question, as far as the archive goes, I was well aware that Fatima Jinnah's papers after her death were collected, and by the 1980s, they were made, late 80s, they were made available through the National Archives. And then began the quest of being able to access these documents. Luckily, there was a list, so I had a good idea of what's there, at least the files that are available, the kinds of correspondence that she has engaged in. It's quite a thorough archive. I mean, everything from receipts for saris that she's bought to, you know, correspondence with noted figures of her time. So the first challenge was getting access to these documents, and it was quite a challenge. It was very hard. I have to say, ultimately, the help of a master's student, a PhD student at Islamabad International University was, you know, very helpful. His professors were very helpful to me, getting me access to these documents. But when I looked at the documents as well, it was also very clear to me that that they're incomplete. And what was really lacking again was the human being. There was lots of factual kinds of data, but very little in terms of her personal life, her personal correspondence, and so on. So I felt that the best way to supplement the information from the archives was to look at other autobiographical literature, other people's correspondences, a little bit of what I could foster. Of course, by this time, most of the people who knew her had already passed away themselves. So whomever I could find that ultimately might have had some recollection, some knowledge of Fatima Jinnah, and put together, therefore, a set of sources that included the archival material, plus various types of autobiographical literature, a couple of interviews here and there, recollections of different people. And hopefully that created a picture of the individual I was looking at and the time and place in which she lived, which was more important to me in certain ways. But I still feel, even having written the book and published it, and now it's been out for some years, I still feel that there's a great deal more that needs to be hashed out, that needs to be thought about as well and researched further.
Absolutely, yes. And this is a sensitive question, but did you feel like even in the archive, there is some sort of, not necessarily censorship, but there is a certain kind of portrayal that we also see through the archive, and maybe you know, some papers not being available publicly. So did you feel like there was some sort of, you know, the resources or the archive that was available was also selective?
You're absolutely correct. You know, a national archive, one of the limitations of a national archive is the same kind of limitation you have when you read a national history, when you read an official curriculum, right? And it's certainly selected, and that was very apparent from the start. I mean, as I was reading literature, you know, about works written by Muhammad Ali Jinnah's secretaries, for example, after his death, people who knew Fatima Jinnah and so on, it was very clear to me that there was material missing. And I'll give you one example that actually kind of hits the nail on the head. I was looking through her letters to different individuals, and one individual that she was in correspondence with throughout her later life, an important figure in her own right, Shaista Ikramullah. Looking through her correspondence, the letters which she wrote as well to Fatima Jinnah, I came across a letter which was not by Shaista Akramullah. And that particular letter was, I mean, I can't verify it. I don't know who this individual was, but it was a love letter. It was very clearly a love letter. At least someone who was infatuated with Fatima Jinnah and thought they had a relationship. But as I said, I can't verify this at all. So it was very clear to me that the only reason this letter survived is because the archivists misfiled it. So the question that I had to ask then is, what else was left out? This would not have shown up in the archive if it hadn't been misfiled. So how much material was left out? Where is that material? Was it just shredded? Is it lying somewhere that's not cataloged? And that's what I mean, that there's a great deal more research that's necessary. And one of the great omissions I found at the archive was exactly this: Fatima Jinnah's personal life. It just didn't exist. You don't know, who her, I mean, this was a woman who lived, 70 some years. Who were her personal relations? Why didn't she marry? Where are her thoughts on love and on, even her brother? Where are her thoughts on Muhammad Ali Jinnah, except for the one little official couple of chapters that she wrote, right? So really the inner person was completely missing. Just the outer shell is there in the archive. And that's what I tried to compensate for through people who knew her. But again, there's a guarded sense that I found even in other people's writings and the manner in which they her. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Almost sort of, there's a very selective portrayal, and what was interesting for me was also the way the papers were catalogued in their sort of catalog, and criticisms to Fatima Jinnah in letters, for instance, were also catalogued in very interesting ways. Like there were some letters which almost had abuses in them. And so, it was a completely different category of letters, but they were all categorized under this heading of suggestions and advices to Fatima Jinnah. So it's really like a toning down of any criticism as well, and just putting up that sort of, just upholding her, continuing to uphold her on that pedestal. So yeah, I think it's certainly a very interesting archive to sift through. And you've mentioned about, of course, sort of the entire symbolic significance around her. And your book is also titled Fatima Jinnah, Mother of the Nation. And at other points, you've quoted in your book that Fatima Jinnah embodied the ideals of womanhood upon which Pakistan was formed, the sort of the ideal woman category. So I just wanted you to explain what were those ideals, and how does the epithet of Mother of the Nation come about, given that Fatima herself was never a mother. She was not a wife as well. So how do we see her conforming to the role of the mother of the nation, or do we ever really see her piercing through that role and challenging definitions around that as well?
So, I mean, the place to begin really is with 19th century reformist Islamic thought, right? In which time the ulama of various schools and backgrounds were faced with the polemical world of colonialism, right? So heavy criticism from a self-righteous colonial state saying we're here to save the brown woman from the brown man and so on. And, whether Hinduism or Islam or whatever the South Asian traditions are, these are misogynistic and these are anti-woman and so on. Of course, this is rhetoric, this is ideology, you know, and British women at the time didn't have the right to property, whereas that right was enshrined and upheld in various classes within South Asian societies. So, so this is rhetoric. It's the civilizing mission of the colonial state that basically prompted all of this. But what it ultimately led to was the reordering of womanhood, the creation of an ideal woman, which, whether coming out of, you know, reformist schools like the Deobandi school or the Barelvis and so on, or coming out of the Aligaris. This is a point which I do make in the book, that the one place where these very disparate and often antagonistic schools come together is in their definition of what a woman should be, right? And the ideal Muslim woman. So they all basically agreed that the ideal woman should be domestic, right? A woman is ultimately defined by motherhood, for example, right? And if she even has a role, like the Aligaris argued that she should have a role in the public sphere by the early 20th century, that argument was being made. It was a nurturing motherly role, right? So as a teacher or as a nurse and so on, not as a rocket scientist, you know what I mean? That there's a male domain, not as a political leader, that's a male domain. So it's about nurturing, it's about ultimately being the mother, right? So I use the term mother of the nation, by the way, because, you know, that's the title that was given her by the state and by the people. But I see it as a very ironic title because ultimately it disempowers her. It makes her this ideal woman rather than liberates her from, you know, this reformist clutch, basically, of domesticity. It defines her in domestic terms, makes the state even her child rather than her political or ideological aspiration, right? So it's a somewhat ironic use of the common kind of honorific that's attached to her as far as I'm concerned. But what it highlights is the fact that ultimately she too had internalized the idea of domesticity, right? So while she's there in the public sphere, particularly in the run-up to partition and then in the early decades of the Pakistani state, while she's in the public eye, very often she is, in fact, representing herself in this motherly kind of way, right? Rather than assuming the mantle of leadership and deciding that she will ultimately put people in their place where she thinks they need to be in their place. It's done in the rhetoric of nurturing and motherhood. And one of the very interesting insights that I found, even from you know, mention of her by other people in their own perceptions and writings, very often was that, you know, she would counsel the women around her who were even going into political life and grasping their role as politicians, not as mothers, right? But as equals to the male politicians in the public domain and so on. She would caution them not to go too far, not to embarrass their husbands, not to undermine their professions and so on by, you know, being too brazen and so on. So you can see that she had internalized this very mode of thinking of ultimately, yes, women should be emancipated, but what does that emancipation means to her? How should it be expressed? Is not necessarily in terms of egalitarian gender relations. It's not necessarily in terms of equal access to the public sphere, but rather with this very reformist kind of 19th century which, by the way, is very heavily influenced by Victorian norms. So the Victorian lady, basically, in Islamic guise, right, is what she very often represented. Yeah.
Yeah, and it almost seems like, you know, that entire metaphor of the nation as extended family, women being allowed to take part in politics because it is the extended family for them. But we see that during the Pakistan movement, because all of these women were sort of neck to neck or working in cooperation with the men, it was all fine. But after independence, and once Fatima Jinnah's tone actually sort of becomes confrontational to the state and to other men, it somehow it's not acceptable anymore. So
Yes. Yes, you're
it
absolutely.
almost seems like she is sort of, there is this chapter in her life after independence, and especially in the election politics. Do you feel like she starts deviating from those ideals, or she is still on the same path but people are reacting to her differently?
Well, yes, I think you hit the nail on the head that ultimately, from what I could gauge, I see a woman, no matter what the limitations were to her emancipation, I see a woman who believed that her fellow Muslim women should be in the public sphere, that they should be politically active, that they should be economically independent, that they should be highly educated professionals, and so on. And that means a high degree of access to the public domain, right? And I don't think she deviated from that particular path, but as I said, there are limits to how far she would go always from the beginning. But when the state actually came into being, well, now all those different roles for women challenged men on various levels, right? They challenged them economically, they challenged them in the household, they challenged them on all these different domains, right? And ultimately, I think therefore there was a pushback. And one of the pushbacks that we see is leaning a move away from the kind of progressive, if I could call it that, the kind of Aligarhi kind of Islam, towards the Deobandi kind of Islam, right? There was a shift that took place. And even men who, presented themselves as upholders of liberal Islamic modernism and so on, became more conservative after the creation of the state. And partly, I think that was as a means to control women, to put women back. The Pandora's box was opened, and now you got to close it. So how do you close it? Well, the only way you can do that is say, you're sinning against God by doing what you're doing. So the lines of thought that are going to say that are the lines of thought that the state tended towards, because it shut down women. I mean, there are very good examples of, in the early years of Pakistan, in the late 40s, early 50s, of women being out, dealing with the refugee crisis, post-partition, dealing with the writing of the Constitution, even though only 2 women were on the Constituent Assembly. But these were active women, and they were part of a much larger network of politicized women. So, when they're being shut down within the Constituent Assembly, they're rallying women outside. And I think much of this played into why Liaquat Ali Khan, for example, succumbed to the objectives resolution and the wording and so on, because these are ways in which to put Pandora back in her box, or put the genie back in the bottle, whichever the metaphor is that you would prefer. But yes, and I think that Fatima Jinnah, however, just like these women, I mentioned Shaista Ikramullah before. Another one, obviously, was Jahanara Shahnawaz. These were amazing figures, right? These are I mean, if you want to talk about political women, especially Shahnawaz, much more so than Fatima Jinnah. And much more work needs to be done on these women, by the way. You know, Fatima Jinnah catches the imagination, but they're the real politicians here. But all of them ultimately had to be controlled. And they refused entirely to basically take the back seat they were asked to take and expected to take. So any kind of pretense or real consideration of women in the public sphere, whether on a constitutional level or on a legal level and so on, is thanks to women like that and the network of women that worked with them, Apwa and so on. But there was always a constant pressure to control them in very much the same way that we see a constant pressure to control the peasantry or control the working classes, the urban working classes and so on. These are threats to established elite authority. So women face the same challenges, absolutely.
Absolutely, I agree. Thank you for those fascinating insights. And I also wanted to ask sort of about Fatima Jinnah sort of growing up, and we look at the sort of religious aspect of it in terms of her religious motivations or religious ideology that she was following through. But besides that, what else do you think may have had an impact on her political philosophy or her politics later on? I mean, growing up in Bombay and the sort of socio-political climate over there. So do you feel like, I mean, what else also possibly impacted her politics?
Well, I mean, this was an era of liberalism, right? For the class, and this is why it's very important to understand her in terms of her class, right? She's a Khoja, she's from a community that's, you know, mercantile, that's been associated with the colonial state from early on in Bombay, that moves in circles that are cosmopolitan in various ways, with the Parsi community and you know, the various other resident mercantile communities in Bombay. That's a commercial hub, right, of the colonial state as much as contemporary India. So that, I think, really shapes her in the very much the same way that it did her brother, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. It's about being liberal. So what did being liberal mean to these people is the question. And for the time and place as I see it, ultimately it meant a tacit sort of anti-colonialism, right? It meant the assertion of individual rights. It meant the idea of representation in government and so on. And at the same time, that had to be balanced with the fact that you are talking about a minority community, whether Khoja, whether Shia, whether Muslim more generally. You are talking about a community that is, in their case, the Jinnah's case, divorced from the land, right? They're not zamindars. They're people who are professionals, urban professionals in various ways. So I think it's in finding that balance that people like Fatima Jinnah, people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah would be attracted to a Muhammad Iqbal rather than, you know, the Maulanas of Deoband, let's say, or even the Aga Khan, right? They're going to go with the kind of reformist Islam that is attempting to reconcile their liberalism with the needs of community, with the kind of weight of history, with the challenges that the future puts in front of them, and particularly with the idea of being a minority. No, I mean, majority-minority politics are part of liberal representative government. They're not something that played a role in the politics of South Asia in the same manner earlier, right? It was a very different political philosophies that dominated the region. So the very idea of censuses and being classified as members of a minority and so on are themselves liberal ideas, right? So all of this, I think, has to be seen in conjunction as a perfect storm of sorts in defining the direction that a Fatima Jinnah would take, or that other women like her would take as well, because they want voting rights, they want inheritance rights, they want a role to play in the urban world that they're growing up in. And so I think they tended towards the philosophies that ultimately promised them that. And I mean, nationalism is one of them, right? Even nationalism as an ideology, whether Indian or Pakistani, promised them this. And reformist Islam of the Iqbalist variety promised them this. And you know, secular liberalism of a completely Western form promised them this. And so these are the kinds of channels into which they went. And unfortunately, as we just discussed in the previous point, they all found a huge amount of resistance when they actually said, okay, well, let's have it, give it to us now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite fascinating to see sort of the rhetoric and the kind of narratives that we see in the sort of late colonial time period in Bombay, and this sort of emphasis on, like you just said, on representation, democracy, uplifting the disempowered, and social work, and all those similar sort of tropes and narratives also making way into Fatima Jinnah's later social work and politics after independence. I also wanted to talk about the election campaign, of course, because personally I find that to be very fascinating, with something that we, you know, that's very, we don't know too much about that. And again, the only bit that we typically know about Fatima Jinnah is her social work, or, you know, all the nice bits, but, you know, that really complicated and time period where there were a lot of contradictions and conflict between Fatima Jinnah and her gender against the established interests. It's all very fascinating. And so I wanted to ask you if you could shed light on, you know, what her election campaign was about, what was the sort of tone of it, how was she legitimizing herself into Pakistani politics, and of course, you know, what sort of reactions did she receive from the state and from the public, so we can sort of build on that point further.
Well, as you put it, the nice bits, those are the motherly bits, right? That's where you're doing for the community, and that's perfectly good. Women can do that, right? But the very fact that she ventured into politics, and, you know, she didn't just take on a male politician, she took on literally a strong man, right? So in that sense, she really went to a place which she was not supposed to go. And that says something, right? That says that despite her own limitations, despite her own sense of ultimately, you know, being conditioned to think of womanhood in a particular way, as we were discussing, she, in the end, was able to transcend it and, you know, see herself at least as someone who's capable and worthy of challenging the establishment of the day, whether they like it or not. And what's really interesting in her campaign, in fact, is just how both General Ayub and her did not play nice, all right? I mean, he launched a massive character assassination against her, as did his cabinet, basically his coterie of very high-ranking and powerful men. He brought in some of the most reactionary and retrograde ulama as well into his fold, and had them issue fatwas, basically condemning her for even stepping out into public, let alone daring to run for head of state and so on. And, she stood her ground. And if you read some of her speeches from the time, she does not hold back. She lets loose and does it in a very, in a wonderful manner. I mean, it's a pleasure to read some of these speeches. I only wish I could have heard them, in person. But even just to read them, they're really, I mean, rhetorically profound. She's a Jinnah. What her brother is known for is what she ultimately showed, that she could hold her own. So in all of these ways, the election to me was very interesting because that was really the moment where she stepped out of the ascribed role for women. It was not nice. It was not the nice Fatma that you saw. And I think that's precisely why even General Ayub was completely stunned. I mean, everyone was flabbergasted on his side by just the power of the attack that she launched on them. And, unfortunately, as with many things in politics, those behind her were as divided and as unruly and as authoritarian and ultimately self-serving as her opponent. So she kind of got caught in between, interestingly, both the government and many of her own, supposed backers. They too put her out there to, in the way that women were kind of put out there in the nationalist, independence movement, and then expected to go back into their box. I rather suspect that many of the people from the COP that supported her were also expecting her to go back in the box, but at least so long as the campaign was running, she didn't. And that really was telling, because it really does, without it having the impact that she, I think was hoping it would have at the time. I'm fairly certain that had she actually won the election, she would have promulgated the constitution that she wanted to promulgate, which was generally the 1956 constitution, throw out the 62 constitution, hold new elections, and have a, parliamentary prime ministerial head of state run the show while she either sat back as a ceremonial head as president, or it just resigned. I don't think she would have actually gone forward, but that's my suspicion anyway. But I think the longer term impact that she had really is a beacon for women in Pakistani politics. And the very fact that she, could stand out there and stand up against the strongman, I think resonates into the present, and not just in Pakistan, but also in what was then East Pakistan, Bangladesh today, continues to resonate. So, but these are intangibles.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, you just mentioned the East Pakistanis, and it's sort of interesting because Fatima Jinnah's relationship with the sort of with either marginalized communities or those who were on the periphery, the East Pakistanis, the refugees, her alliance with the Pashtuns. So can we, and of course women, so can we champion her as a leader or a sympathizer of the disempowered masses, or is that sort of, or is that sort of the category of people who jumped on board to put Ayub Khan down from power? And also, I mean, it's again, when we're considering Fatima Jinnah's relationship with other ethnic identities, do we sort of see her deviating from Jinnah's broader vision of, Pakistani nationalism and not falling into a provincialist line of thought, which is something that Ayub Khan then also started criticizing her for being a disruptionist or provincialist or siding with Wali Khan and Abdul Ghaffar Khan's family. So do we, I mean, of course, this is speculation. Do we sort of see her deviating from what Jinnah may have done? And just in general, what are your thoughts about her siding with these sort of disempowered factions?
I mean, the way I look at Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, is that he was Governor General, and he used his power, right? I mean, he didn't sit back; he used it. Fatima Jinnah, on the other hand, did not have power. She never had power, but she, I think, the more she grew as a political thinker, she was a federalist, right? She believed in federalism. And that's what I gleaned from some of what I read coming from her own hand. But she was a federalist, and federalism means that minorities are protected, whether they're religious minorities or ethnic minorities. There has to be a balance of power. And I think for her, therefore, any constitution that was put in place would need to protect the ethnic identities and so on of the state. So, whereas Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, pretty much brushed off the idea of Bengali as a national language. She didn't. I mean, under his influence, she spoke against it, but at a later date, she didn't, right? She was in fact in favor of the 56th Constitution, which saw Urdu and Bengali as national languages. So I think she, as she matured, she understood that the only way a state like Pakistan could stay together was to balance, again, majorities and minorities, right? I mean, the lack of balance in majorities and minorities is what led to partition. So I think she saw pretty well that if within Pakistan that balance is not found, well, it will lead to its partition, as it did ultimately after her death, right? So I think that is why she gave voice to the various ethnic groups that were disenfranchised with, a small coterie basically in power. And in so doing, for the ordinary person, for the masses, she then becomes their representative, right? Again, I wouldn't confuse that when you think of the millions of people who poured onto the railways when she was going from Dhaka to Chittagong, for example, or when she went from Lahore to Peshawar, or whatever, the different road trips that she took. The millions and millions of people who came out onto the railway tracks and onto the roads and so on. I would see them as people who hear her on the radio, or if they, read her words in the paper, and, she's talking about their rights, whether they're underclasses or their ethnic rights or whatever else it is. And so that's where I think they could support her. As far as the political classes, though, go, they're provincialists, right? So that was the weapon which Ayub had. That, yeah, you're hanging out with people who want to, separate, whether they're Pashtun or whether they're Bengali or whatever. You're hanging out with separatists. You're undermining Pakistan. So I think, again, this is, whether we can call it her political naivete or whether it's just a stark reality, but she was a constitutionalist, I think, and believed ultimately, rightly or wrongly, that if you have a constitution with the right checks and balances to ensure federalism, then you can downplay the sectarian, because she also spoke very heavily against sectarianism, not just ethnic chauvinisms, right? Then you can check all of this. You can have a balance. And that's what she ultimately, I think, if I recall, there were a couple of speeches, probably more, but in which she said exactly that, that what we need is not a person, what we need is institutions that can deal with these issues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is sort of interesting to see, this is the first election in which we see this conflict over what Jinnah's ideals were truly about, what they were really about. And we sort of see Fatima Jinnah sort of, having her own rhetoric about, what Pakistan movement was all about. It was about people's sovereignty, people's freedom, and look, this is where you've come to now. You all participated in this movement, but you're not free anymore. And so her slogan is about Pakistan movement as a movement of freedom and obviously decolonization. And then you see Ayub Khan appropriating that, again, Jinnah's Pakistan ideal, and saying, no, actually Jinnah's Pakistan was about Muslim nationalism. It was about everybody sort of staying united together and not promoting these kind of disruptionist activities. So it is sort of interesting to see that election period as possibly the first time where there is openly such a dispute over what Jinnah's ideals truly were about Pakistan and how they're materializing now. So, and of course, lots of contradictions in that time period as well. I think we're running out of time as well. I mean, we do have 10-15 minutes, but I wanted to end talking about Fatima Jinnah with this particular question about her sense of disillusionment, which you talk about in your book, and of course, which prompted her to come out into politics. And there is scholarship now around other political figures. Ali Raza has written about Mia Iftikharuddin, and this narrative of disillusionment after Pakistan was created, and a feeling of betrayal, and Pakistan just did not live up to its true ideals. So would you place Fatima Jinnah in that same category of a lot of leftists, all of these discontented factions? Some of them, I feel, were just sort of, they just thought there's no point in anything really. It was all a betrayal. And with some other figures, I feel like there was constantly this drive to fulfill that ideal, that dream, that utopia. So, I mean, what would you say about that? Would you place Fatima Jinnah in the same category as everyone else who felt that this was all just a betrayal?
Well, she was definitely disillusioned, right? And she was definitely a person who felt that the political elite, whether military or civilian, had betrayed the people of Pakistan, had betrayed the ideals that she believed her brother stood for, and so on. And this is very much part of her thinking, as far as I can tell. Her standing up and entering, politics at such a late age, and basically leading to her end, exhaustion, right? However, tells me that she still felt that as far as she's alive, as far as she has anything to say about it, she's going to fight for those ideals, right? And it doesn't matter if Ayub Khan says there's something else, or it doesn't matter if, she, spoke very harshly of many of the people within her own support, right, within the combined opposition parties. So it doesn't matter if they are unsavory sorts that she, didn't have any respect for, whatever. As long as they support the fight for the cause, whatever the cause is in her opinion, she stood up and fought for it. So I think that's just it, that where Fatima Jinnah, provides some insight, I think, for the tensions within Pakistani society is right there. You again pinpoint it very accurately, that there is a sense of disillusionment. What was the point of partition? What was the point of millions displaced and millions killed and so on, if not for a better world and a better society? Unfortunately, disillusion can lead to, people just throwing their hands up and saying, oh, well, what was the point? Let me immigrate, let me bury my head, or, hide out from the world, or whatever else it may be. Or others who would say, well, why am I disillusioned? I'm disillusioned because there was an ideal I believed in, so I'm going to continue to fight for that ideal. And I think that that's where she falls, right? That's what she seemed to live by. But ultimately, I think it's very, very clear to me that she did not lay blame for the failures, right? The sources of her disillusionment on Muslim nationalism, or on the Pakistan movement, or on the need for partition and so on. She saw the failures due to a corrupt and self-serving leadership that inherited the state from the earliest and has held on to it until she died, at least, and I would argue continues to in various ways. And this is her, I think, both source of disillusionment and her want to overthrow them. In the most simplistic ways, to say, yeah, put in a constitution that empowers the people so you can sideline this corrupt bunch who do nothing but sow sectarianism and provincialism and ethnic chauvinism and so on. They do nothing but that, and the only reason they do it is to empower and enrich themselves. They have no vision, they have no ideology, they have nothing. And I think that's precisely what Fatima Jinnah said. Well, but we do have an ideology. We can define it if there are contradictions in it. And that's what we should be working for, not just giving up the way others did and have. Hope. There's hope there's always hope in her life in certain ways, right? Whether justified or not, I don't know.
Absolutely. I think I will just end with a broad and cliche question, which is about, especially for people who are not that interested in history, or who talk about, oh, why should we care? She was just a figure in the past. We have to move on. But I do feel like she left a very important legacy, and especially through her speeches and quotations, they almost feel like they're so relevant even in the present day and age. And it almost feels like our politics has really not changed since that time period. So maybe if you have any examples or any sort of, final thoughts about why her life is important to study, her politics is important to study, and her statements and speeches themselves. Why is she important for Pakistan in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most dangerous thing, and perhaps the most disempowering thing, is to put Fatima Jinnah on a pedestal, all right? See her as kind of above and beyond the saintly figure, which is precisely why that's exactly what the state does. The very state that she saw as corrupt and ultimately self-serving, the very elite that she saw as corrupt and self-serving, are the ones who write her as, oh, well, there's Fatima Jinnah up there, bow down, and that's all you need to know about her. So to me, as I said, my book is an attempt to be scholarly, move away from the hagiographic. And the reason why I would say it's, an incomplete project, however, and I look forward to seeing much more work done on her and her class of people, that generation of women in particular, is because ultimately what they give us is a sense of what beyond reacting to being a minority, beyond reacting to Hindu chauvinism, beyond reacting to India, what Pakistan means for people or has meant for people, right? So it's not in the reactionary sense, in other words, it's in the positive sense, the proactive sense, what it means. And Fatima Jinnah in her speeches and so on very eloquently represents one vision for what this place is supposed to be. And it raises problems. I mean, you know, how do you have a parliamentary democracy? How do you have equal citizenship when you still speak in terms of, you know, sectarian divides and ethnic divides and so on? These are problems that need to be addressed. These are problems that and contradictions that Fatima Jinnah did not address, right? But it's the ideal that you need before you can even say, okay, well, yeah, here's the problem in front of us, not allowing us to get to that ideal. So how do we solve it, right? What's really necessary is intellectualism. And that, unfortunately, is what I think those who don't have a historical consciousness miss out on, right? Why is Muhammad Ali Jinnah relevant? Why is Fatima Jinnah relevant? They're long dead. What does Muhammad Iqbal have to offer? Well, I mean, what they have to offer is ideas. And you can't solve your problems without ideas. That's what it comes down to. So, and Fatima Jinnah is a wonderful example, but she's only one of many. And it's the ideas that are out there that need to be looked at and need to be thought about and critiqued, and the problems that they raise overcome with new ideas. But you can't have it. You know, I tell my students, I teach a world history class. Pakistan today is a largely agrarian society, right? The plow was invented 6,000 years ago. The plow that's being used today was invented 6,000 years ago. So if we don't know when the plow came about, we can't understand a contemporary agrarian society, right? This is an extreme and facile example, but in exactly the same way, if we have a problem before us and we don't look at the people who've expressed ideas on how to overcome that problem, well, then we're never going to overcome it because we have no point of departure. We have nothing to build on. But, you know, Fatima Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Muhammad Iqbal, and a host of other figures, to me, are the building blocks on which we can look at the future and look at overcoming the kinds of problems that exist. So if we ignore them at our peril.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for those insights. And you mentioned a couple of other female figures which were important in this time period, and I absolutely agree with you. Their lives are so fascinating, especially Begum Jahan Ara Shahnawaz. And
Yes.
I wish that her autobiography and her writings would be more publicly available and read by the public, because it does seem like she is she's so progressive for her time period. And it is quite remarkable that nothing has really been done as such on her as well.
Well, we'll leave it to you to do it. We'll leave it.
Absolutely. But I mean, Fatima Jinnah's sort of fight and challenge against a dictator I find it very fascinating. And especially that there was this one line from her speech where she said that when she was sort of retorting to Ayub Khan, and she was saying, patriotism is nobody's monopoly. And I feel like that line is so relevant in the present day and age, because, you know, established elites and state would sort of, you know, decide who is Pakistani enough, who is patriotic enough, and anybody who chooses to disagree or dissent is, you know, compartmentalized as unpatriotic or, you know, an Indian agent. So I feel like if Fatima Jinnah received all of those criticisms and insults, then that can happen to anybody. But I do feel like she pushed back against that, and those are really important quotes for me. And I feel like people should really. Her speeches are available
Yes, they are.
in various different libraries, right? So I think it's definitely a very good archive.
The speeches are available both in manuscript form. Some have been selected. I mean, in the archive, there are many in manuscript form. Some have been published, edited and published in translation as well. So yes, they're available and they should be read. You know, and I think the more work that there is, the more they can be contextualized as well. But as I said, ultimately, the context is that they are the speeches of a person, not a saint, and that's important, right? It's just another person who's thinking this and saying it and acting on it and so on. And that's to me what's empowering.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for those final thoughts. It was really interesting to have this discussion with you on this very important topic. And I'm really grateful to you for being available and shedding light and your opinions on this topic. So thank you for joining us. And I thank everyone else who tuned in and listened to this conversation. Please stay tuned for the next session of Ideas Conclave. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.